12 teams, 25 rounds, 300 picks. Every player in NFL history. Welcome to the all-time NFL Draft. The MMQB gathered legends of the football world. NFL execs, former players, football historians, and reporters picked their squads in a fantasy draft where every player from every era was available. Each offense consisted of one quarterback, two wide receivers, two running backs, one tight end, and an offensive line. Each D had two cornerbacks, two safeties, and could either run a 4-3 or a 3-4 front seven. Special teams consisted of one kicker and one punter. Teams also had up to two wildcard slots and one coach. Who got picked? Who didn't? This is the all-time NFL Draft.
If you were asked to draft an all-time great NFL team from current and former players, where would you even start? Well, the MMQB tackled that very question in an ambitious project to figure out the value of the best football players ever. 12 experts, from reporters like Peter King to former Packers executive Ron Wolf and Hall of Fame quarterback Dan Fouts. They each drafted squads of 25, and the top overall selection was linebacker Lawrence Taylor. Now, you can find all 12 teams plus a ton of associated content on the MMQB.com, but I'm joined now by Peter King to break down this all-time draft. Comparing eras can just be a near impossible task. How did you go about picking Otto Graham versus Tom Brady?
Well, it was very interesting. I am a huge fan of football history. For instance, Don Hutson, who is like my favorite receiver of all time because when no one else is throwing the ball, he had 99 touchdowns, a record that stood for 44 years. He was picked the pick before I picked in the first round. But one of my cornerbacks is Dick Knight Train Lane. When he played, he was Deion Sanders. So in my opinion, I want a guy who in his era dominated his era. My first overall pick in my draft was Tom Brady.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that.
Yeah, he's sitting there at number 9. I said I had no intention of taking him. I named last year after the Super Bowl, Tom Brady is the greatest quarterback of all time. How can I not take the greatest quarterback of all time with the 9th pick in the draft?
Peter, hold that thought for just one moment. Before we go any further, let's see all of the players who were selected in the first round. We know Lawrence Taylor went number 1 overall. Here's who the other team owners took first. Mean Joe Green goes second in this draft, followed by Johnny Unitas, and then punter Ray Guy. Dan Fouts, what were you thinking? We get back to reality with Anthony Munoz at 5. Jim Brown, Reggie White, Don Hutson played for the Packers from 1935 to 1945. He's our first wide receiver off the board. Peter King took Tom Brady. Then a run of quarterbacks, Otto Graham, Joe Montana, and John Elway. Peter, quarterbacks went relatively low in this draft considering the importance of the position. Why is that?
You know, there were so many great quarterbacks in NFL history. That's why I wasn't really thinking about getting a quarterback that high because I just figured when I made my list, I'm happy to take my 11th or 12th guy because he's maybe the best quarterback of a 20-year period. So I was not worried about getting a good quarterback.
The Hall of Fame is the ultimate sign of greatness, right? Well, in the MMQB's all-time draft, you might be shocked at how many players don't have a bust in Canton, and how many Hall of Famers didn't make the cut. Of the 300 selections, 68 retired players still haven't been enshrined. Add that to the 21 active players picked, and that's nearly 1/3 of the rosters that aren't in the Hall. The highest pick used on a non-Hoffer was Tom Brady at 9, but for him it's just a matter of time. It wasn't until pick 131 that we got an eligible retired player, and just because you have a statue in Canton doesn't mean you were picked in the all-time draft. 75 Hall of Famers didn't make the squad. That's almost a quarter of the Hall that didn't get in, and they include big names like Steve Young, Lynn Swann, Thurman Thomas, and Bart Starr. Check out this offensive lineup of leftovers. You think they wouldn't put up points? There's simply too much talent on the gridiron.
Albert Breer, Andy Benoit, as neutral parties, we wanted to get your thoughts on this all-time draft. Andy, I'm going to start with you. How would you go about building a team? Would you go by position or would you go by player?
Well, obviously, you start at quarterback. And the thing to understand is if you don't have a great quarterback, you basically, and this is true of almost any era and especially now, you basically have to be great at every other position. So take the other 21 positions on the field. Can you hit 18, 19, 20 times on your picks there? Or would you rather try to just hit on the pick at quarterback? It's much easier to find the quarterback than it is to find the whole rest of the team.
I mean, I'd agree. There's no question that you have to start with the quarterback position. And then I think what I would do is I would try to find the players that are the hardest to replace. And so what players are you looking for that can change the game for you where there aren't very many of them? Cover corners, outside linebackers and defensive ends that can rush the quarterback, left tackles. Those guys make other guys better.
Okay, so Andy, who would be your number one overall pick?
It'd probably be Tom Brady because look at all the different systems he's done it in. He has played in a vertical offense with Randy Moss in the late 2000s. He's played in a quick strike offense in these years. Now he's in kind of a hybrid offense, and he runs that show in New England. Coaches around the league, it is lore. Those who have gotten to watch Patriots practices, they are in awe of how in control Tom Brady is. I would absolutely begin with Tom Brady.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Tom Brady also. And I think what separates him from almost any other quarterback in the history of football, he literally was the front man for two different dynasties. He's had different number one receivers. You go back to the beginning of his career, his number one receiver was Troy Brown. He went to an AFC title game with Rashae Caldwell and Jabbar Gaffney as his top two targets. That, to me, is what separates Tom Brady from every other quarterback. He plays the most important position, and he's won with so many different casts of players. There's no better way to measure how a player makes someone else better than to look at the different types of players he's won with and the volume of different players that he's won with. And Tom Brady absolutely checks those boxes off.
Albert, I'm going to go back to you on this one. There are certain players who were really just prototypical cornerstones of their era. Yet if you put them in today's game, they just wouldn't be as valuable. Are there any great historical players that you think honestly just would not be useful in today's game?
Well, I don't know if they wouldn't be useful, but there are positions that have been devalued. To me, the number one would be the middle linebacker, the traditional old school Ray Nitschke, Dick Butkus, that middle linebacker who maybe wasn't as adept in coverage, who was kind of the tough guy who led the defense. That guy might be coming off the field on third down now. So that's one position where I think you can look and you can say some of those players from the 50s and 60s might be overvalued then versus where they would be now. And then, of course, the running back position. I mean, there's a reason why Zeke Elliott went 4th overall last year. There's a reason why Christian McCaffrey went 8th overall this year. It's because they're not just running backs. And so a guy like a Jim Brown, who was absolutely a great player, and I think, you know, the football version of LeBron James, just this force of nature, an overpowering guy who was bigger and stronger and faster than everybody else. In today's game, would you be able to use him in the passing game the same way?
Jim Brown was taken 6th overall in this draft. That is 2 positions behind punter Ray Guy, who Andy was taken by Dan Fouts at number 4. Fouts says he took him because there's a larger disparity between punters than any other position that he could see. Is that defensible at all?
Dan Fouts does his job well. He puts in the work. With all due respect to Dan, I'd have to say, no, that's not defensible. That's indefensible.
Aside from Ray Guy, did you see any other reaches in the first round?
Here's the question, Maggie, okay? Like, the question for me is, are we talking about the game being played the way that it is right now? Because if we're talking about the game being played the way it is right now, I don't like Jim Brown 6th overall. And I'm going to go down the list. Like a Rob Gronkowski was 103rd, right? Von Miller is 101st. Those are guys who have profound effects on the passing game. That was maybe the best player outside of the quarterback in Super Bowl 49 and the best player in Super Bowl 50, regardless of position. Those guys affect the game in a more profound way than a running back can now. And so I know this sounds like I'm picking on Jim Brown. I just wonder how you'd fit him into today's game.
Andy, I'm going to go back to you because a cornerback was taken 38th. The first one off the board, Deion Sanders. Was that too late for a corner to be selected?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if again, it's about what era we're playing in. Albert's right. But when you have a number one corner, and what we mean by that is a guy you can put on an island and say, you got him, worry about nothing else. Not only do you have a guy that can take away the receiver he's guarding, but you can scheme differently with those other 10 guys. And coaches will tell you that's absolutely invaluable. That and an edge rusher are the two things that make or break most defenses. Do you have a true cover corner who can operate by himself? Do you have an edge rusher? And by the way, if you don't have the edge rusher, the cover corner, he allows you to blitz more because he doesn't need any safety help. That gives you one more free defender. I would take, if you told me Deion Sanders has to be my number one overall pick, I'd have no issue with that. Absolutely no issue.
This one is for both of you. Andy, you go first. 20 years from now, so we're looking far in the future, which players that weren't drafted would be?
The one that stood out to me, because I think you start with that Cowboys offensive line. That is the most dominant offensive line I've ever seen right now. Travis Frederick at center got drafted. Right guard Zach Martin got picked. But left tackle Tyron Smith, who's the best athlete of those three, I didn't see him on the board. I checked multiple times. I didn't believe that he wasn't drafted. My guess is there are a lot of really good left tackles over history that got picked. Tyron Smith will be one of them when his career's over.
Very interesting. Albert, what about you?
I have a list of them. I think Andrew Luck's going to be on that list. I know that he hasn't been great the last couple of years, but to me, he was able to carry a team into the playoffs his first 3 years as an NFL quarterback, something that very few players have been able to do at that age. I think he's got the right general manager now in Chris Ballard, who's going to build up the infrastructure around him. And I think you're going to see him in the next 2 or 3 years be back in the conversation, competing for a Super Bowl as one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Zeke Elliott's somebody else who I think, because of that infrastructure he has around him with that offensive line, is right there as a guy who is a generational type of back. Khalil Mack in Oakland, who didn't have great sack numbers this year, but was the defensive player of the year, I think is absolutely going to be somebody who'd be in that category in about 5 or 10 years. And then I'm going to give you guys one wild card, okay, from the rookie class. I think one of the two safeties that went in the first round, Jamal Adams or Malik Hooker, is going to be in that conversation. I think those two were the surest bet. And I know that sounds crazy to say about a rookie, but I just listened to enough scouts talk about those two. I think at least one of those two is going to wind up in that category.
No pressure at all. Just go into your rookie season with Albert Breer expecting you're going to be drafted on an all-time greatest NFL players list. Albert and Andy, thank you guys so much for lending your expertise. We appreciate it. I mentioned before, Lawrence Taylor goes number 1 overall, and he did change the game in a way that was forever altered it. We often say, though, that Jerry Rice is the best football player of all time. Peter, he didn't even go in the first round. How do you explain that?
I think because most people who look at pro football history, not to demean Jerry Rice in any way, but I think the further you get from that great 49er team, I think it's like the further you get from the Dallas Cowboy team. They watched Emmitt Smith play and they loved Emmitt Smith. But the further away you get, you realize that this team truly won because of a team. And, you know, I've thought that Joe Montana would go ahead of Jerry Rice, and he did. And again, not to be in any way demeaning of Jerry Rice, but I think that the quarterback in that element, in that equation, rather, is going to be a higher pick than the wide receiver.
No Adrian Peterson in
the
this
two
draft.
guys, I was shocked. No Adrian Peterson and no Thurman Thomas.
Okay, so the most current and most recent running backs that even made this list are Marshall Faulk and LaDainian Tomlinson, who now have been away from the game for quite a long time. Considering how the game has evolved and football has changed since its beginnings, if you were to ever draft another all-time team, I mean, would a running back go similarly as low? I mean, would we ever see a running back who's playing today even get on one of those teams?
Well, I think the problem with the running backs, and I was stunned that particularly Adrian Peterson, stunned that he didn't get picked. But again, you can take one running back and then one fullback. So, I mean, I love Gale Sayers. I was going to pick Gale Sayers if I had a chance to do it, and I did. And my fullback is Franco Harris. The extra player, though, he was among those who I thought of for the extra player. But you know what I wanted in my extra player, my wild card player? I ended up picking Darren Sproles. Yeah. Because in my opinion, I want, to me, the most dangerous. This is the era for dangerous weapons to play all over the field. In my opinion, in the last 15 years, Darren Sproles has been the best hybrid player in football. And I think he's terminally underrated. And I love Darren Sproles, and I got him in the last round, and I'm thrilled that I was able to do that.
In this era, you can't talk about football without including a fantasy football component. We broke down the numbers to figure out which of these teams would win, not just on the field, but in fantasy.
The MMQB All-Time NFL Draft teams are a fantasy football player's dream. Imagine Dan Marino throwing to Calvin Johnson. But how do the numbers add up? First, SI selected the best statistical season for every player. Then, we adjusted those numbers for different eras. I mean, Dan Marino throwing for 5,000 yards in 1984 was unheard of. Now, there's someone who does it almost every year. So we tallied the stats and plugged them into the standard fantasy scoring format. Some things stuck out. Almost across the board, the older the player, the lower the stats. The running back class had the most deflation. Only one running back had a 2,000-yard season after adjusting for era. But 9 running backs didn't even break 1,000 yards. In the end, the worst team was drafted by Dan Fouts, who picked guys like Terry Bradshaw and Joe Perry. They only scored 1,241 points, and no player on his squad broke 300 points. The best team of all time belonged to the NFL Hall of Fame's Joe Horrigan, with a whopping 1,961 points. His squad was led by the best fantasy season of all time, achieved in 1942 by Packers wideout Don Hutson. Then, he caught 1,211 yards and had 19 total touchdowns. But the adjusted stat line is just bananas. He had 2,458 receiving yards, 37 total touchdowns, and scored 468 fantasy points. Dreams really do come true.
So, who do you think top to bottom had the best team if you can be impartial?
Oh, well, I'll be impartial. I'll tell you a team that I think was extremely good is Rick Gosselin's team. Now, Rick Gosselin, to me, is the king of the mock draft. He's the longtime, very respected Dallas Morning News pro football writer. And I think he did a fantastic job because he involved all different eras. He got John Unitas to be his quarterback. He got Roger Craig to be his fullback. He got LaDainian Tomlinson to run the ball. And I believe that every player on his defense, with the exception of Neil Smith, is an all-decade player. I like his team. But, Maggie, I really, really love my team.
Peter, this is really fun.
Thanks.
Great
It was a great
exercise,
time.
and it's just really great to go through and see all these, players. And some of them, I'll admit, I had to go back and look some of these guys up. I hadn't heard of a couple of them, and so it's really cool, informative, and I learned something too.
Thanks, Maggie.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Of course, you can check out the MMQB's all-time draft project on SI.com. And of course, we'll be back tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Eastern. But until then, stick with SI.com for all the latest news and follow us on Twitter at SI Now Live. See you tomorrow.